Today, the whole immigration reality we are living in our time is something to rethink and ask ourselves how we may be responsible for the atrocities happening to immigrants. The story of an immigrant begins in a country that has been a target of exploitation. As a result, there is a lot of corruption and persecution, and consequently, the most vulnerable victims migrate as a way out of that inferno. The stories we hear of immigrants abused by corrupted society are so many. The journey of a migrant family makes uprooting themselves from everything they know that is part of who they are, their homes, their families, their friends, their culture, their food, all because of the danger they face in their homeland. Gang violence, corruption, extortion, death, poverty, lands that are dry because of environmental changes making it impossible to grow anything. All this contributes to a massive migration north. Immigrants hopeful that in the United States, they have a chance at life. They want their children to be able to be safe from being kidnapped, raped, murdered, a chance to live in peace and together as a family. Because it is nearly impossible to have that in their own country, they flee and dare to journey north. All neighboring countries are also struggling, and families are at high risk of being victims of violence there. It is for that reason that they journey to the United States. Unfortunately, their journey is not an easy one. Aside from having to borrow a big amount of money to pay their smuggler, they end up going through so many hardships along the way. Gangs and criminals are out scouting them. They are easy prey to kidnap and to ask for ransom. They endure long hours of walking through very difficult terrain. Many of them end up hurt and suffering from severe wounds. The stories they share of their journey are so sad and heartbreaking. I recall a father who was traveling with his little boy. Along the journey, they encountered two young teens by themselves and they tagged along. As they crossed through Mexico, he shared how they were pulled out from a bus. They took them to a stash warehouse where they had other immigrants there. There, the two young teens were taken away. And he shared that how they could hear the young girls screaming and crying, and they never saw the young girls again. When they pulled this young father out of the crowd of migrants, they told him he needed to have his family send him some money. They threatened to kill his son, and if he didn't, he shared how they took his son and pointed a gun to his head, and he then saw how the gun went off, and for a moment he thought his son was dead. This father, reliving this tragic, traumatic moment, said that at his amazement, he saw that he was still alive, and he said, crying, I don't know if it was a miracle that he didn't die, or maybe they were just bluffing to scare me and have my family send me money. With all the hardships immigrants go through in their journey north, I'm certain that if families knew all the dangers they encountered in their journey, they would definitely rethink twice before doing this journey. I'm certain it is not an easy decision to make. It is possible that trying to determine what is more dangerous, staying home where there may be a sure death, or risking the unknown and possibly encounter death along the way. The truth is, the immigrants have it hard either way. If they manage to survive the journey through the different countries they need to cross, they will encounter other more difficult obstacles further along, especially when they reach the border Mexico-United States. The families wait in Mexico, in the Mexican side, under terrible conditions. With the latest U.S. policy forcing families to remain in Mexico, many have remained in the border for over a year already because they have waited out in the open in a makeshift tent city. The conditions have gotten worse as Mexican organized crime have strategically controlled who enters the United States and have victimized immigrants in every way possible. They find that migrants waiting at the border are easy prey because the US policies are forcing immigrants to wait in Mexico. This has given them more power to exploit these families. We hear of constant atrocities that immigrants are victims on a daily basis. Most recently, we have heard of several immigrants found dead along the riverbank. Just this past week, a mother shared with me how her little 15-year-old was raped when she went to the restroom during the night. I asked her, ¿Por qué fuiste sola? Why did you go by yourself? And she said, I was in a lot of pain and I had diarrhea. It is so sad how women are so vulnerable and easy targets to those who have no respect to life. The question I ask myself and I ask you, how can we call ourselves to be a country of high moral principles, country of laws that protect good of humanity, and have policies that completely disregard the sanctity of life in the immigrants?
Hello, I'm Jenifer Wolf-Williams, and I'm a mental health professional with a focus on humanitarian immigration. Full disclosure, I'm a grandmother from the rural Midwest who knew I had to do more. So in 2011, when our youngest child graduated from high school, I convinced my husband to move to Dallas because I wanted to work with asylum seekers. You see, when governments and other powerful groups torture ordinary citizens, a small percentage of survivors make it to the US and plead for protection. These are asylum seekers, and these are my clients. And early on, they taught me two vital lessons. First, asylum seekers are amazing people. They're strong in their weakest moments and resilient in their greatest pain. And they are these things not just for what they have survived, but for the richness they bring to a community and to a nation. For a short time, they need us, but in the long view, we need them. My second lesson was that trauma therapy in this context is complicated because while the client works through the initial pain that pushed them from home, they simultaneously navigate new traumas inflicted by the US immigration system. This has never been more true than it is right now. And over the last few years, policy changes have meant that fewer and fewer asylum seekers could make it to Dallas. So I began making regular trips to the border regions. On my first visit to Matamoros, Mexico, just across the bridge from Brownsville, Texas, I spoke with 4 Nicaraguans who were next in line for their interview with our border patrol. They'd fled home because government forces assassinated their friends and they feared they were next. Now, they'd been at the door to the US port of entry for a full 4 days. They depended on volunteers to bring food and water because if they left the bridge, they could lose their chance for an interview. But it was midday, and US Border Patrol had not processed anyone yet. The day before, officers had processed only 2 people. A little farther out, families with young children lived on the streets, sleeping under tarps if they could get them. They too depended on volunteers for survival, and many had been waiting for months. Everyone who felt like talking about it described extreme violence and extreme poverty in their home countries. But to me, the most horrible part of the day was the walk back across the US bridge into the US. The line for passport holders was short and simple, but it took us past a glass wall where we saw a huge empty room with rows and rows of empty chairs. A man behind me whispered what it was: the room where asylum petitions are supposed to be processed. We, the people, owned this safe, empty space, while a few yards away, our officers were telling families, we don't have room to process anyone else today. Yet when I made that first trip, the brutality of the so-called Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP, also known as the Remain in Mexico policy, was still to come. At that point, asylum seekers who passed their credible fear interview were allowed to enter the US for protection, but the Remain in Mexico policy denies that protection. It forces asylum seekers to wait in makeshift refugee camps for months, where they are vulnerable to cartels, kidnapping, rape, disease, and hunger. They're traumatized and their children are traumatized. So I partnered with Dr. Selma Isnaga, a counseling professor from the Rio Grande Valley, to create a mental health flyer. It wasn't enough, but it was something. I returned to Matamoros to distribute the flyer and talk with camp residents about mental health during migration. My goals were simple: assure them of the normalcy of their symptoms, offer basic self-care ideas, and plant the seed that counseling might be helpful if they ever get the chance. Mostly my goal was to listen. And on this first trip back after MPP, I could see at a glance that the policy had made everything 1,000 times worse. Camping tents, the kind I might use for a weekend getaway, lined the streets and the levee as far as I could see. Parents stood outside holding babies, gathering firewood, cooking on open fires. There were no structures, no showers, no utilities, just 10 yellow outhouses for a community of more than 2,000 people, mostly young families. Children played in the dirt, and my heart melted when 2 young boys suddenly ran up to hug my knees. I climbed the levee, walked between coils of razor wire, and looked around. A few yards higher, a woman sat alone, her expression empty as she watched me approach. I greeted her cautiously, not sure how she might feel about my presence. "Hola, me llamo Jenny," I told her. "Soy Violeta," she responded, and invited me to sit with her. The smoke from her campfire blew across our faces, and it wasn't long before she said, way too matter-of-factly, "I sent my daughter across yesterday." Her daughter was 9 years old. Violeta had stood near the bridge and watched her child leave. She waited until an officer took custody, and then Violeta walked back to her tent, alone. "I couldn't let her suffer anymore," Violeta explained. "She was raped here. We were both raped." "Here in the camps?" I asked, and Violeta nodded. "Sometimes people disappear from here too, adults and children. I couldn't let her stay any longer." Violeta looked away and added, "I'm going back to Central America now. The gangs murdered my parents when I was 3, and now the same gangs are targeting me, but I'm going back. There's nothing else for me to do." That evening, I reported Violeta's account to my Brownsville and Matamoros colleagues, and their faces grew weary. They were quiet for a moment before they explained, "This happens all the time." And they were right. I visited a similar encampment in Nogales where 2 mothers requested birth control for their 11 and 12-year-old daughters because rape was inevitable. And frankly, the US government planned this. Public statements released by the Department of Homeland Security acknowledge that. Just like the highly publicized zero-tolerance family separations, MPP is an intentional harm put in place to deter future asylum applicants. And here's a key point we need to acknowledge. These horrors would never have been planned for white families. Family separations in MPP are one more manifestation of America's racial injustice. Today, if you can imagine, the situation is still deteriorating. Today, almost no one crosses. Even children are turned away. You probably don't need a mental health professional to explain the harm caused to children and adults by family separation or by being forced into life-threatening conditions. Decades of research link such events to impaired neurodevelopment with long-term damage to cognitive, emotional, and social functioning. Survivors carry a lifelong risk of depression, PTSD, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. Parents, and sometimes children, struggle with thoughts of suicide. US policies also harm those who carry them out and those of us who watch. Participants and bystanders are subject to perpetration-induced traumatic stress, PITS, with symptoms similar to PTSD, as well as an increased risk of violence against others. So, how could practices so harmful go unchecked? Social psychologists explain it as moral shift. We all share the sacred values of love and compassion. But in moral shift, we believe we are at risk of losing something, so we tell ourselves it's okay to ignore our values. Next, we blame national problems on a target group. Our leaders tell us that group is a threat. They describe its members as less deserving or as less than human, and we adapt this language too. Finally, We inflict intentional harm. Leaders tell us they must harm the target group to protect the rest of us. Harm is now defined as virtue. We have already reached this lowest level. Many asylum seekers have died, and many are unaccounted for. Families are permanently separated, and despite what we were promised, family separations continue. Each cruelty brings risk for another. But in moral shift, there is one more possibility. Moral recovery starts when people who are not targeted see what is wrong and refuse to pretend we didn't see it. So here's what I'm doing now. Against all odds, immigration attorneys still work diligently along the southern border and in ICE detention centers to stand with asylum applicants through their legal process. And mental health professionals can stand with them by documenting trauma histories, emotional and cognitive impact, and fear of return. Our testimony doesn't always change the outcome, but sometimes it does. I've done this work through my private practice for many years, but now I'm leading a new effort, the Immigration Assessment Project. We connect immigration attorneys with passionate mental health professionals who will document immigrant mental health at no cost to the attorney or to the applicant. Sometimes attorneys reach out with urgent needs, a statement about the nuances of trauma memory or the emotional harm of solitary confinement. And even if the judge doesn't listen, these statements become part of the legal record. So we write, interview, study, and write some more. We build a body of evidence and hope we can help our clients be safe, be free, and be with their families. And one day, we hope to bear witness to the human rights abuses of the system itself. It's still not enough, but it makes a difference. So if you're wondering what you can do, I would challenge you to take 2 steps. First, be that voice in the room. Speak where you are, to your church, your school, your congressperson. These policies will end when the public demands it. And next, connect with others who serve these communities. We are many. I would certainly welcome you to contact the Immigration Assessment Project, and I know other project leaders would say the same for the work they're doing. Connect with a group where you can serve, because together we can move toward moral recovery.